Welcome to Circular Firing Squad. I'm Marty Jency as a counseling faculty at Kent State University and host for Circular Firing Squad. We have 4 members, 4 questions, and 4 answers to each question, because each squad member generates a question that we'll have to answer, ranging from the pastoral to the pathetic. Some interesting questions tonight coming up just from what has been submitted and what we're going to be working with. Let's see who's with us tonight on this episode.
Hi, everyone. Elliott Ingersoll, professor of counseling at Cleveland State and host of Apply Topically.
What's up, everybody? Mitch Conrad, clinical mental health counseling student at Cleveland State University and counselor trainee at Baldwin Wallace University.
Hi, I am Steph Martyr, and I am a doctoral candidate at Kent State University and a licensed counselor practicing a private practice.
Okay. You know, we are broadcasting this not only as a podcast that you can pick up later. You can pick up the audio, but you can also find us when we have a show on Sunday nights at 7:30 Eastern time at youtube.com/@CFS podcast. And that will get you to our live stream on the site, and you can watch and play along at home if you want to. Elliott, I think you've got.
Okay. Why do you think, or do you think, the counseling degree has to be a graduate degree?
So I imagine some of this is coming from the idea of what it could look like in Ohio if the governor is interested in pushing this for undergrad stuff. And I have some interest in that and also some amount of concern, right? What does a 4-year undergraduate program look like? Does something like counseling move more towards a trade? And also, I think it depends how it's done. If this is something that is in the current format of curriculums where a lot of stuff is focused on a general type of education and less a trade education, then I think it's actually I have some amount of worry and fear about that, because then I think it's unfocused. And so I do find that my graduate program, for instance, the high focus on counseling, the high focus on self-reflection, the high focus on really deepening connection and meaningful relationships is that feels like that's been extremely helpful. And to go in with people who are also doing that, we're all sort of there for the same thing, really feels like it matters. And I'm worried about some of the focus of it and the intent behind it. I do think that it seems clear that, more counselors, especially for kids and adolescents, is important. But, I have some amount of worry based on how it could potentially be implemented. I think if it's integrated into the current system where someone's maybe getting 2 actual years of classes, how are they doing an internship? I've got a lot of questions with it right now. Don't know a ton about it, but I would say that right now I have more concerns than not.
Well, the first thing that I was thinking of when I heard this question or read this question was that I think just being older, and this kind of goes to some of what Mitch was saying about self-reflection and, even gaining insight and having that space to kind of grow as a professional versus just learning stuff from books. And I do think the older you get, most people still have their master's degree before their prefrontal cortex is done developing. And you need to work that part of your brain, I think, to be an effective counselor. You need to do all of that work on yourself. And if you're so young at a certain point, there's not stuff to, there's always stuff to have worked on, but you're not getting to a point where you're oh, I better go back and, maybe reprocess some of this stuff because it's getting in the way of my adult life, because they're still sometimes living through that survival mode or whatever else they were growing up in. And so I think the master's program and requiring that, or a graduate degree of some sort, might not necessarily even be completely about the content or the abilities somebody has. But at the same time, to be an effective counselor, I think for the most part, people have to get to a point of looking in themselves and doing the work that they're going to ask clients to do. And if you're at a certain point in life, like if you're young, if you're 20, usually you don't have time to do that yet. And this at least maybe gives a few more years to allow somebody to grow into that.
Oh man, you and I, Steph, are sort of in the same framework. I'm going to take it a little further. Does it need to be a graduate degree? Yeah, probably, because you need to have some, if we can still have like a liberal arts way of looking at education in the future, you still have to have some world knowledge that you get in whatever discipline you get in. I think it should be a graduate degree, and I think people should be over 30 before they're admitted to the degree. Just for some of the reasons that Steph said, we're still trying to figure out our own lives and get it sorted out. And at 30, it's not like we have everything together, but we're further along the path. We've had some more life experience. We can be a little bit more self-reflective and internal. All of these things, I think, are just great qualities for counselors to be able to have and develop. So, when I read it, why does counseling need to be a graduate degree? It only for the purpose of age and maturation, because, if it could be an undergraduate degree that only people were admitted over the age of 30, I would still have some of the same questions or issues because they haven't gotten any other type of well-rounded education or educational experience. So graduate degree, post 30 years of age, not a popular stance to take, but I have my reasons.
No, this is fascinating because I think, three of us were definitely on the same page here, but I am not convinced it needs to be a graduate degree, but my first thought was it's more about maturity. It's about maturity. And that, the fact that you were both on the same page. And, but I wouldn't make someone go through an undergrad degree just because they needed to mature. Maybe they could do that in another way, But that's a weird one because the more I thought about it, the more I thought, yeah, maturity. But then, of course, we know there's degrees of freedom in any theory of maturity. So you can't really, can you have a cutoff age? I don't know. But good answers. And I'm still thinking about this one.
Mitch, you're up with the next question.
Yeah. And just like, I feel like we could talk about that previous question like for an entire episode. It's very interesting how that's going to pan out. So we may have used this one before, but it's nice to check back in because the field can sometimes move pretty quickly with the things that we're saying. So if we have, then okay, we have, and we might have some new answers here now. What's your least favorite word or phrase that counselors have started using?
Yeah, I think it's funny how these go in phases. And one that kind of came up that just has started to really grate on me is the spoon theory, and that how people only have so many spoons in their drawer or just in their possession. I'm assuming it's in their drawer. And you can give so many spoons to this individual and have this many spoons to tackle this task. And so you can't be in the negative of spoons. And I don't know. I just feel like did it all need to be repackaged as spoons to take it to another level? This idea of only having so much energy, almost having only so much headspace, almost having so much in your reservoir, your cups, filling cups. Did we need spoons on top of all of these other metaphors for people's energy and how they use it and what they put it into? I don't know. I don't like the spoons.
I'll tell you, I'm going to come off as being the cranky old man through all of the questions tonight. It's just, yeah. Let's see. The answer to this question, Mitch, what's your favorite word or phrase that your least favorite word or phrase that counselors have started using? let me see, what's the flavor of the month? Oh, yeah, trauma. So trauma-informed, trauma-infused, trauma reduction, trauma frappé. It's beginning to feel like pumpkin spice, the pumpkin spice of counseling. So for me, it's gotta be trauma. We've been treating this for a long time, folks. And so you're wrapping it up in a package where folks have been doing this, and I'm not sure it does. I have students who come in their first class that they're taking in the program go, I want to do trauma informed counseling. It's like they've picked it up from the counseling drive-through or something. And it just really bothers me that they don't have an understanding of that. And frankly, that term's is repackaging a lot of stuff that we used to use and putting it in pretty workshops and presentations. And so, yeah, a cranky old man, I'm sorry, but it's anything that's related to, that has the flavor of the month involved in it.
It's beginning to look a lot like trauma. Yeah, that whole thing, same deal here, Marty. Trauma infused, trauma everything, trauma informed, trauma counseling. But I would also say other fads get under my skin as well. So it's what this too shall pass.
Yeah, thanks everybody for your answers. This is one that I'm not exact. I feel like I'm working through a new one, which is this idea of radical acceptance. And the reason that I don't like it, because I was getting into ACT a little bit, and I think in some ways, I understand the principles of it, but I feel like it can be said in a way that can be received as pretty invalidating. That someone needs to just completely accept what their situation is, and that it can almost produce, it seems like it's almost like producing this learned helplessness kind of thing of oh yeah, well, your situation is just garbage and that's what it is. As opposed to really thinking about it from a strengths-based modality, or how do we work through this together? It just seems like a weird kind of thing to say, especially to if someone's saying that to someone else, if they're saying it to themselves, that's fine. But I do wonder what it says to another person in the room who's receiving counseling, when the idea and the message is well, just radically accept your situation and I guess you'll feel better, right? That's maybe not exactly what's going on, but I do worry and wonder a little bit about what that does, and the type of mindset that can put someone in. I think that there's something to be said about just accepting where you're at, and accepting your situation, and accepting what's going on, and being very present. And also if we're just sort of accepting everything that's going on, then I don't know, there's a reason for change, I guess.
Hey, I want to tag in real quick. I just don't want to lose sight of something Marty said in his answer. The counseling drive-through. The counselor drive-through, I want to come back to that.
How do you want to come back to that?
Let's use it as a final shot. What would you order from the counselor drive-through?
Oh, yeah. Maybe we're going to have two, because I've been waiting to get this week's final shot question out every time I get behind the wheel. Steph, you've got a response, or you've got a question.
Both. But I'll do the question first. What trends do you notice between newer counselors and the way you learned how to be a counselor?
Oh, I guess it goes to me first. What I notice differently is counselors now want to do without any concern about being. Transparency, genuineness, ignoring the power of the relationship. They just want to do, and they want to know what to do. And it's sort of a utilitarian approach towards being a counselor. And I think some of that is guided by empirically supported treatments. It's fed by motivational interviewing and those kinds of strategies. And it's turned us into counselor doers instead of counselor beers. And I guess when I was being trained, it was about certain micro skills that we had to learn, but we also had to be able to incorporate our authentic self in the process. And we've moved away from that. So that's what I notice with newer counselors versus the way I learned counseling. And I get a little sad about it because you see people in the program learning how to be a counselor with very little understanding from what I can see, very little understanding of their own self and how that plays a part in often interrupting the process of the client. So
It's a good question. I was thinking about how just how much more facile they are with technology, with apps, and I would even say conceptualizing what role do online services have. I'm always impressed by that because, I'm, partly by choice, just partly generational. I'm always a few steps behind. Yeah, and I appreciate, some of the directions people are taking it. It's like anything else, it can be done well or poorly.
So I guess being in with a lot of newer counselors right now, I think maybe the best way for me to answer this question is like, well, maybe what did I witness in counseling growing up that feels like very different? I know that the field is moving away from a lot of the stuff that like I received inside of counseling. So like I received a lot of cognitive behavioral therapy. And it seems like the more people who I speak to, generally the worst vibes that I get about cognitive behavioral therapy, because it's one thing to sort of like provide the therapy, and it's one thing like how does it feel to receive the therapy? These are very different things, and we don't have as much qualitative data on the client experience in a lot of therapies to begin with. I always worry a little bit if cognitive behavioral therapy were a client and was coming into your office and was calling themselves a gold standard of something, how we would sort of react to that and what we would sort of say about that form of what we would say about that person. And so I do believe that people are opening up to different kinds of therapies and not necessarily like taking like one specific intervention. CBT is still the most popular therapy last I checked, but it's been reduced by far, and I imagine in the next 10 years it won't be the most popular anymore. So that's one trend that I've noticed.
Well, thank you very much for these answers. And yes, and then also I think the idea of staying out of it without like self-disclosure. I think self-disclosure while people are still you know they know to not go in and share everything of themselves, hopefully. But I think that the fear around self-disclosure is dissipating a bit. I notice people are a little bit more like, hey, I'm human. Like, it's okay to be human with clients, not necessarily, in a positive way. I don't think it's all necessarily in a bad way. I think they're moving away from that kind of more of a sterile, the tabula rasa kind of ideology, and moving more into that the humanistic side a little bit more, but not the way Rogers would do it. I think, but I think that they're trying to infuse some warmth and trying to show that they are human as well, and that's what I kind of notice a little bit more. Maybe it's, still kind of floating away from theoretical, but and more into just trying to like form that relationship, the therapeutic relationship. And in some ways that's also could be really effective, as we know that that's the most important factor. I don't know. That's something I noticed.
yeah, So, Steph, again, you and I think, are on the same page with what newer counselors are doing than what we learned. You're a little bit more optimistic. I told you I was going to be grouchy all episode, and I think the grouchiness for me comes from what's going on in society politically and such, and so that kind of weighs on me around it. So my question really is something that popped into my head based on what I'm seeing going on in society. So I hope most of our listeners have either heard of or read or saw the movie Fahrenheit 451. Science fiction written by Ray Bradbury. The movie was probably sometime in the 70s, and I'm not sure it's been redone. The concept here is firemen, as we know them today, turn out to be firemen who go and burn books and the idea is those books are things that could counter the government. And the idea of free thought and thinking is counter to the government. So the message, I think, even though it was written back in the 50s or 60s by Ray Bradbury, really applies now. And the folks who are fighting this in this book are creating their own society where they're selecting a book, knowing that some of these books will be burnt. And before they're burnt, they are memorizing the book in its entirety. So you have books in people's heads that's the way knowledge is going to continue on through the generations and survive this approach to quelling free thought and ideas. So my question for the group is, what would you choose as your book to memorize?
I've already started on this one. Stately, plump Buck Mulligan came round the stairhead bearing a bowl of lather on which a mirror and razor lay crossed. The first line of James Joyce's Ulysses. That's the one I would take.
Yeah, you're a big fan of Ulysses. I know that, Elliott, so I can see that happening. Mitch?
Yeah, so, the interesting thing about this question is you are tasked with selecting a book to memorize. This is maybe operating under the assumption that I could memorize a book. And I'm not sure if I could. So, I think the honest question about like what book could I actually memorize, maybe going with something like The Very Hungry Caterpillar, something a little simple, although I'm not sure how much knowledge is really being passed down there. 1984 comes to mind. I think that with the idea of government overreach and certainly increase in, sort of like the surveillance state, the threats to individual privacy certainly have me worried. They've had me worried really since, around, was it maybe like 2012 or something, when some of the net neutrality is really big for me. And so I always worry. That's my big worry, is not necessarily when, books being burned, sure, and also PDFs exist, but as soon as they start, really controlling what is like free internet, that's when I'm really worried. So I think 1984 or The Very Hungry Caterpillar, one of those two.
Mitch, I feel like, yeah, we are kindred spirits on this question. I was like, which book would I want to select for this task? Maybe something like Animal Farm. But what I would select is Where the Wild Things Are for length. Yeah. But I mean, Animal Farm is not, really long book. It is no Ulysses. And that is just props to you, Elliott, because I was thinking about other books and I'm just like, that wouldn't even be, happen. So I think Animal Farm might be like my reach book, but I'll stay with Where the Wild Things Are.
I figured all the good books, or all of the masterpiece books would have been taken. Like they've done somebody's got Shakespeare, somebody's got, all of Dickens is taken care of. Somebody else has measured that. So I set my sights a little lower and maybe a little more obtuse from what you would think would be standard reading fare. The first book that popped into my head was Harlan Ellison, and the book is called, it's a collection of his writings. And any Harlan Ellison would be good because it's counterculture, it's extremely well written. It's kind of science fiction, science future, but based in reality. The collection that I would go is Alone Against Tomorrow, and that's subtitled Essays on the Alienated. So these are all short story collections that he has put together, and the stories, the protagonists in the stories have a sense of alienation. It was one of the first books I read in Ellison that I stole from my brother's bookshelf. And I distinctly remember reading the story, which is one of my favorites of his. I have no mouth and I must scream. And as a teenager, just those words kind of struck some meaning. So Harlan Ellison would be a pleasure to be able to memorize and carry that on to future generations if they were going to burn all the books. And my guess is would be the first books they'd want to burn. That, is besides some of the larger known things like Animal Farm in 1984. The book that I kind of came back to was Shel Silverstein's Where the Sidewalk Ends. Because one, it would be fun to memorize those poems. It would be cool to have to recite them over and over again in your head and out loud to be able to remember them. And let alone to do it in a Shel Silverstein voice makes it even more entertaining. So Harlan Ellison or Shel Silverstein, that's kind of my selection. Elliott, I think you're silenced.
Sorry, it was a time joke.
Oh, okay.
It's out of time now.
All right, we've moved on to, so final shot question. Other drivers' moves that give you road rage?
I really have been doing better with this, but I still think bumper chasing or bullying other people, and sometimes then I'll get behind them and bumper chase them like, who's the jerk now?
I've overwhelmingly, felt so much better. Like, I feel like so much better driving, but I feel like I just completely zone out now. I don't even understand how I get to point A to point B. It's just I've done it for so long. The one thing that's still, and I think I may have mentioned this on the show before, is just I really do appreciate when people put their blinkers on. That's really nice, especially when we're right near me and going into the other lane. This doesn't happen as much as it used to, but it still does happen occasionally. And I just really appreciate when people put their blinkers on, because I don't really like those kind of driving surprises.
I know that I have talked about like cliche type of moves that give me road rage, but today I'm going to talk about something more personal. I live on this little road, and at the opposite corner of my block is a bank, and the exit drive goes onto our road, and then there's a main road. So they come onto our little cut-through street. I mean, yes, cut-through street, but I'm exiting my house, and I'm trying to go to the main road, and they see me coming, and they zoom out of the bank, and then they sit forever because they don't know how to get into the main traffic from this little road. And I have had years of practice. And so we're just sitting there endlessly as traffic goes each way. And they had plenty of time to turn, but they also just had to zoom out in front of me when they saw me coming instead of just waiting, and not zooming out in front of me and just letting me take my rightful place.
I've been waiting to ask this question as a final shot question for a bit. And when I learned to drive, I learned that if you're in the left lane and you come to a left turn lane with a light, that you need to pull out in traffic. And the theory there was if the first guy was out in the middle of traffic, you could creep out past that intersection a little too. And then the third person behind you, when the light turned yellow, believing that people will not rush through yellow lights coming in the opposite direction, you would take your left turn and two other people behind you could then make a left turn through a yellow light. Road rage for me is sitting behind the guy that stopped right at the intersection before you, without going into the intersection, has his left turn blinker on and sits there until till the light turns yellow, and then will take the left turn after it turns red, leaving only him to go through the light or her to go through the light. Drives me nuts. Where did these people learn to drive? And what's their logic there? So if you run into any of these drivers this week, please give them the middle finger salute in the process. It just
into them.
A quick segue. I was behind a person and there was a light that had to be activated. And finally, it wasn't going. And I just got out the car and I went up and I said, you got to move up. He goes, why? I said, because there's an actuator there. He says, activator? And I go, no, actuator. He says, what's the difference? I said, I have no idea. I just want to get through the light.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah. And Elliott, when you talk about people chasing your bumper, mm-hmm. I can't believe that. And they chase your bumper when you are 30 feet behind another car. It's not like I can go any faster anyways. And, usually when people get that close, I like dinner and a movie first. But we can go on for various. Aileen is like, you're always talking to drivers. They cannot hear you, and I need to let go of some of this stuff, but this is an opportunity to do it. Thanks to the firing squad, Elliott, Mitch, Stephanie, for joining us tonight. Look for some of these characters on their podcasts on the podtalk.net. That's the website. You can also find other shows on the podtalk.net, including Vision Profiles, which we stream live on Monday nights at 9 p.m. on YouTube, and is also available to pick up at other times. And then one that I started with my son called Gear Up and Go. He and I discuss different technology that you need to travel with and talk about our takes on it. I don't think we're the most brilliant people in there, but you might get a few ideas from listening to that show. And that comes out weekly. We're shooting for Sundays at noon Eastern time to record and stream live with it. Our theme music is from Menage a Quad, Real Swing Shet. That's it for this episode of the Circular Firing Squad. Ready, fire,